Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us at the Consortium of Indo-Pacific Researchers. This is the third day of our international conference, Great Power Competition, a challenge to the rule-based order. So this panel is focused on historic lessons from the Pacific Wars. We are going to kickstart this panel by the keynote address from Dr. John Hall. I would like to briefly introduce Dr. Hall here. Dr. John W. Hall is the Ambrose Hasseltine Associate Professor of Military History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He has been served as an active duty U.S. Army officer before joining the History Department. Mr. Hall is a former member of the faculty at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and most recently served as the Chief of the Future Studies branch of the U.S. Army's Future Warfare Division at Fort Monroe, Virginia. His perspectives on the future of warfare are balanced by his research in colonial, irregular conflicts and civil-military relations. Mr. Hall is the author of volume Uncommon Defense, Indian Allies in the Black Hawk War, Harvard University Press 2009, and the Military History of the Indian Removal. He holds a BS in history from the U.S. Military Academy and a PhD in history from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He served in the U.S. Central Command and the Joint Chief of Staff too. Very welcome, Mr. Hall, to join us. And before I invite him as for his address, I would like to announce that views expressed and presented here are personal, should not be construed to any organization, any department, any institutions. Thank you. Mr. Hall, over to you.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be with everybody this evening. On the face of it, I think I'm kind of a curious choice to be addressing this body. I make no claim to being an expert on any facet of Pacific affairs, and my joint time on active duty has not included any stints with Indo-PACOM. I have nevertheless served on the Joint Staff for 3 years and in 2 combatant commands with a keen interest in great power competition or strategic competition, the current term of art. Those are U.S. European Command and more recently in a more significant capacity with U.S. Central Command. My wife asked me what I was going to talk about this evening, and when I told her the subject, she replied, "Are you allowed to talk about that?" Now that I'm retired, I replied, "I think I can talk about whatever I please. At the very least, I no longer need to send my remarks to OSD policy or to the NSC for comment or adjudication, as I did when I was General McKenzie's speechwriter at CENTCOM. Nevertheless, my wife's reticence on my behalf reminds me that I too should make clear that the views I am expressing this evening are mine rather than the official positions of the Department of Defense or CENTCOM. I can't accurately claim that they are mine alone, as my views are informed by what I had an opportunity to observe over the past 5 years, the first 3 in the Pentagon and the last 2 at CENTCOM. These last 2 assignments affirm for me the validity of Miles's law. Where you stand depends on where you sit. On the Joint Staff, I occupied a fairly humble station in the Joint History and Research Office, but I was nevertheless a fly on the wall for some significant discussions regarding the rebalancing of DoD's strategic priorities. The national security strategy of that day was rather explicit. Great power competition was in, and the Middle East was out. Not entirely, but the campaign against violent extremist organizations, or VEOs, was to move from the driver's seat to the very back row, a cramped one at that. While no one at the time cared much what my views were on the subject, I was nevertheless wholly on board with this reprioritization. Unfortunately for those in the Pentagon who wanted to see it happen, Iran and the past administration's animosity toward it kept the Middle East at the very front of the queue when it came to demands on DoD's attention and resources. This was the source of some frustration for the force providers, the services, as well as for those in the Pentagon who run the global force management machinery. Indeed, one of my last consequential acts in the Pentagon was to put together a day-long symposium for the JADERs, the generals and admirals in charge of the various directorates of the Joint Staff, on the historic significance of the Middle East and how to restore it to its former and proper place as an economy of force theater. Ironically, my perspective on the Middle East began to shift subtly while doing the research to organize this event, and further evolved upon arriving in Tampa just over 2 years ago. I'm embarrassed to admit it, but I was previously unaware that none other than Alfred Thayer Mahan coined the term Middle East in a 1902 article in London's National Review. Like most naval officers and imperialists of the day, and he foremost among them, Mahan thought the United States' destiny as a great power revolved around the Pacific, and more specifically, access to Eastern markets. It was this concern that drew his attention to the Middle East and the Persian Gulf, which he claimed dominated the land and sea routes from Europe to India and to the East and beyond. It was, in other words, geostrategic key terrain of the first order that Britain, the global ordering power of the day, had a vital interest in controlling. Indeed, Mahan declared that it had a duty to do so. Were it to fail, control of the region would likely default to Russia, Great Britain's strategic competitor for most of the 19th century, and one that did not abide by what Mahan and his British readers regarded as the rules of the road when it came to free and open trade. The Great Game, as this particular great power competition was called, was already near its end, but it's nevertheless striking that Mahan's argument ran precisely against the grain of those that predominated during my time in the Pentagon. In the name of strategic competition with a great power and vital interests in South and East Asia at stake, the world's lone superpower should invest resources and forces in the Middle East. An interesting aside in this article, Mahan also says, and I quote, "Both Persia and China are being swept irresistibly into the general movement of the world, from which they have so long stood apart. Both have a momentous future of uncertain issue, but that of China is evidently more immediately imminent." Now, lest I leave you with the impression that Mahan was more prescient than he actually was, he thought the real value of the Persian Gulf was to be found in the construction of a sea-to-land transshipment terminal at its head. It seems that he was unaware of the Darcy exploratory concession that Britain and Persia had compacted the year prior, and which would pay off in 1908 with the discovery of oil in Persia. That discovery would thereby alter the specific rationale of Mahan's argument, but not its underlying logic. Indeed, only a year after the publication of Mahan's article, and still 5 years before the discovery of oil, the British Foreign Secretary announced to the House of Commons a British version of the Monroe Doctrine regarding the Persian Gulf. Of course, the disintegration of Britain's empire following World War II diminished both the means and interests in continued investment east of Suez, but not of the geostrategic significance of the Middle East to the newest round of great power competition. Mahan may have coined the term Middle East, but historians Bernard Lewis and P.M. Holt claimed as early as 1962 that the idea of the Middle East was a product of 20th century strategy, which is to say, a Cold War construct, one born of great power competition. It was, as Mahan had predicted, the vital arena of competition for the world's two remaining superpowers. So it remained, at the very least, into 1980 with the enunciation of the Carter Doctrine, in which the United States pledged, as had the British 77 years earlier, that the United States would not hesitate to use military force to safeguard its interests in the Gulf region. But in the ensuing decades, the United States at large lost sight of the Middle East as a preeminent arena of great power competition. This had much to do with Iran's emergence as a non-aligned regional threat and the triumphant multinational campaign to eject Saddam Hussein from Kuwait in 1991, an event that roughly coincided with the dissolution of the Soviet Union and thus the end of a great epoch of strategic competition, or even, in the words of Francis Fukuyama, the end of history itself. But of course, history did not end in Western triumph circa 1991. A new chapter opened in spectacular, horrific fashion 10 years later, introducing 2 decades of continuous military action to subdue the threat posed by a range of terrorist threats sheltering in the region. I needn't tell anyone participating in this conference how quickly or how profoundly many Americans suffered from buyer's remorse regarding the wars the United States launched in Afghanistan in 2001 and Iraq in 2003. Operations in the former country concluded only last year. Combat operations in the latter ended on the 1st of this year. Thus, for an entire generation of Americans, the very term Middle East, which also encompasses the interminable Israeli-Palestinian question and the bad penny that is Iran, conjures up a jumble of things that we are just plain tired of. In an age of nearly unprecedented political divisiveness, there's been one thing on which nearly all Americans could agree over the past decade. It's time to end our so-called forever wars and focus on things that really matter. Strategic competition mattered. It was in. The Middle East, meanwhile, was a graveyard to American nation-building delusions and was out, as was U.S. Central Command, which had laid claim to a disproportionate share of U.S. capabilities and resources for over 20 years and would have to accommodate itself to a new reality. But how new was it, really? CENTCOM, after all, was not founded to confront the threat of terrorism, let alone to direct the wars in Iraq or Afghanistan. Rather, CENTCOM was established in 1983 in response, albeit delayed, to the Islamic Revolution in Iran and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. In the latter regard, it was the organizational embodiment of the Carter Doctrine, and in fact, a combatant command purpose-built for great power competition. This fact was widely unrecognized as the Defense Department tried to accommodate the Asia pivot. Competing successfully against Russia and China meant investing more significantly in U.S. European Command and Indo-PACOM, respectively, and divesting elsewhere. It's not surprising who was expected to pay the bills. But eagerness to divest from the Middle East carries considerable strategic risk. American allies and partners in the region have kept their finger on the pulse of Western sentiment and sensed both war weariness and Middle East fatigue more generally. Consequently, they have at once invited the United States to demonstrate our commitment to the region through the continued basing of U.S. forces and solicitation of foreign military sales, and hedged by exploring similar arrangements with the United States' principal competitors in the region. These are naturally Russia and, far more significantly, the People's Republic of China. But why are they there? Because they can clearly recognize what the United States struggles to while nursing its global war on terror hangover. The region sits at the historical and enduring crossroads for overland and maritime trade between Europe, Asia, and Africa, and is home to half the world's proven oil reserves. It is the very definition of geostrategic key terrain. Anyone who doubts the continued importance of the shipping lanes at the heart of Mahan's 1902 argument can navigate their way to marinetraffic.com and observe the unremitting flow of cargo vessels, depicted in green, through the Indian Ocean, or reflect on the fact that the 6-day closure of the Suez when the merchant vessel Ever Given ran aground cost the global economy $416 million an hour. Need I say that oil remains important to the global economy? This is especially true for China, which depends upon the Persian Gulf for roughly 40% of its fossil fuels, which is also illustrated on marinetraffic.com by the nearly unbroken chain of tankers, depicted in red, running to and fro between the Gulf and China. In the interest of time, I will not enumerate every one of the ways in which Russia and China are expanding their influence in the region, but I will cite just a few from my last significant accomplishment as a member of General McKenzie's personal staff at CENTCOM, his posture statement to Congress as of this last April, from which I quote, "The People's Republic of China and Russia have tailored their regional approaches to suit their specific goals and have expanded military cooperation with many regional countries through both arms sales and exercises. People's Republic of China has expanded its presence through its Belt and Road Initiative, COVID-19 diplomacy, debt trap infrastructure investments, and the proliferation of 5G technology that will provide opportunities for political coercion and military exploitation. While trying to wean U.S. partners from the West, Russia and China simultaneously pursue warmer relations with Iran, really trying to upset the balance of power in the region." I could go on, and I do direct your attention to that posture statement, which is posted on the CENTCOM website. But suffice it to say that while the United States has been looking for the Middle East exit, Russia and China are eager to move in and have already begun to do so. The most obvious danger that I referred to earlier then is, paradoxically, failing to compete in the name of strategic competition. The newest national security strategy, published only last month, nods to the fact that great power competition is by its definition global, but I think it might have gone further yet in recognizing that global doesn't mean everywhere. It means in places that matter. The Middle East is clearly one of those places. I was also gratified to see the new national security strategy acknowledge that the United States and its allies have invaluable partners who may not accord with our democratic ideals, but are nevertheless invested in the free and open order we uphold. I read this as a subtle rebuke to the allies of the current administration who wish to cut off foreign military sales and other collaborations as a convenient means of punishing them for not upholding our values or refusing to ramp up oil production. I'm sympathetic to this impulse, but it is a course that runs the real risk of alienating partners who will look for new ones less liberal than we, a distinct possibility that augurs poorly for the advance of liberty within these nations, let alone internationally. While I'm offering armchair commentary on the new national security strategy, another word of praise. I was especially pleased to see how much space is devoted to improving domestic resilience, namely the safeguarding of our democracy and investing in key strategic sectors and supply chains, especially, to quote the strategy, critical and emerging technologies such as microelectronics, advanced computing, biotechnologies, clean energy technologies, and advanced telecommunications. As I have already mentioned, strategic competition is global but requires focus on really important places. I would humbly submit to you the single most important theater in which the United States needs to invest to compete successfully with China is within the homeland itself. Now, to be clear, I'm not arguing against the investment of greater resources or attention into the Indo-PACOM area of responsibility. Far from it. But at the risk of leaving you with the impression that I am an unreformed Mahanian, which I am most certainly not, I'm going to leave you with another of his observations. This one's offered in the Atlantic in 1890. Although it would be another 24 years before the Panama Canal would come into being, Mahan could already foresee that it would draw European powers into the Caribbean and allow them to menace American interests in the Pacific, to say nothing of the West Coast itself. In this regard, at least, he predicted little trouble in moving his fellow Americans to take preemptive action, because such a development would strike directly at the heart of the Monroe Doctrine. The precise value of the Monroe Doctrine is very loosely understood by most Americans, he wrote. But the effect of the familiar phrase has been to develop a national sensitiveness, which is a more frequent cause of war than material interests. And over disputes caused by such feelings, there will preside none of the calming influence due to the moral authority of international law with its recognized principles. For the points in dispute will be of policy, of interest, not of conceded right. As we prudently continue to pivot to the Pacific and embrace strategic competition in earnest, we should do well to recognize the national sensitiveness of our competitors, lest we invite that which we hope to deter. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hall. That's a fantastic address that given by you. Like you started from Mahan, that I was also reading a book recently about Alfred Thayer Mahan, what he said. And it's not the recent, it's like more than 100 years back. And starting from the end of the history and now the strategic competition, but it's a global competition. And you just tell us about the power vacuum, the problem of power vacuum or the concerns of power vacuum. Right? When there was a withdrawal from Afghanistan, it was said that Russia will come or China will come and will take the place there. So maybe that is a concern, but again, you gave some great ideas of policy recommendations that's repairing something at home and then go for the competition. Thank you so much, your valuable remarks and inputs, and definitely that will help the emerging researchers and the students here. Thanks again for taking time.
Thank you.
Now I would like to invite Chris, who is the head of the military history team at the consortium and a senior fellow at the consortium for further proceedings of this panel. Chris, over to you.
Thank you very much, Indu, and thank you, Dr. Hall, for those outstanding remarks that actually, in many ways, are a great segue into what we're going to talk about today. The military history team was created to use history to both inform the present, but also influence the future. Look at how did we get where we are? What are potential lessons of the past? And also potential factors that we've seen in history that may impact what's going on going forward. And so it's with that in mind, we've got a great panel of historians this evening and commentators to look at some case studies from what is probably one of the most important events in the last 150 years in the Indo-Pacific region, and that is the Pacific War and its immediate aftermath. So it was World War II and the years immediately following. In many ways, if you look at Asia and its geopolitics and even its geography, World War II and its aftermath is yesterday. And so we've got three great case studies that are going to look at it both from a geostrategic, but also from a defense and a strategy perspective. I'm going to introduce each of the panelists. They're going to talk, make their presentations one right after another. And then at the end, if there's any questions or any discussion, we can have it at that time. If anybody during the presentation has any questions, please put them in the chat and I can filter and ask the questions as we go. First up is going to be Lieutenant Brendan Donnelly of the United States Air Force, who is stationed at Cannon Air Force Base as an intelligence officer and has published several times already with the consortium on the website, and I think has a few more things in the pipeline. Second is going to be First Lieutenant Grant Willis, also of the United States Air Force, also stationed at Cannon Air Force Base. I should mention Brendan was an Air Force ROTC graduate from Bowling Green State University. Grant is also Air Force ROTC out of the University of Cincinnati and has published as well with the consortium, and I think has a few more things in the pipeline for sure. And then last but most definitely not least is Jose Custodio, who is an old friend and colleague from Manila, a noted defense commentator in the Far East, has worked with the Philippine Department of National Defense and various other institutions there. And you can occasionally see him on CNN Philippines and other places in Asia on TV. So with that, I'm going to get out of the way. And Brendan, if you could lead us off, and then from you, we'll throw to Grant, we'll throw to Jose, and I will be back for the discussion. So take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Chris, and also Dr. Hall. I wish I had so much time to unpack what you were talking about. As a military member, that entire speech just was something that I want to hit on, but I don't have enough time. So kind of like what Chris was talking about, moving into the Indo-Pacific region, I'm focusing on one area that is actually starting before the World War II. So I'll be starting off around 1912. But realistically, what I'm talking about is Chinese power projection in the future based on observations from the invasion of Tibet way back when in 1949. And so moving forward, let me make sure I get this. Here we go. So to give a baseline overview of the invasion of Tibet, the similarities of what happened in Tibet and then what we could potentially see with an invasion of Taiwan, impacts and applications for today for the coalition, and then additionally any closing comments or questions. So to get right into it, first off, 1912, so before World War II, of course, Chinese revolutionaries declared the Republic of China. So before even the People's Republic of China, there was the ROC. That was the Chinese side. And then on the Tibetan side that you can see on the slide there, that was where the Tibetan monks were. That is where in 1913, they also declared their independence. So immediately within a year, we have a difference in opinion. And then we also had the 1914 Simla Convention. So this is actually where the Chinese, this is the first time that we really saw them not agree to something, especially with Tibet. That was where the British India and the Tibetan government discussed exactly what the border was going to be, just making sure that that is differentiated. And then to skip forward just a little bit, from 1927 to 1949, that was where the Chinese Civil War came out. And it's funny to mention that just because I'm going to be talking about Taiwan later with Chiang Kai-shek versus Mao Zedong. So of course, the former of Taiwan, Formosa, being settled by Chiang Kai-shek and everything. But that's to really lay the battleground of what I'm going to be talking about. In Chamdo, which is going to be that orange area that is more specifically called out on this map because of large portions of the Chinese military originally taking that in the Tibetan-Chinese War. And so in 1950, this is a key point. This was where after the Civil War, the Chinese Mao Zedong was now able to look back at Tibet, look at the different locations that he wanted to incorporate into the new China. And he presented a 3-point agreement to Tibet. First off, for Tibet to basically accept itself as being part of China, for Chinese troops to care for the defense of Tibet, and then for China to hand all foreign trade relations in Tibet. This is something that we could potentially see in the future, but this is a tactic that we've now seen with China very many times, where at first they're going to try the diplomatic approach, the political approach, and it's the exact same thing with the Tibet invasion. And so, of course, these 3 points basically say Tibet is owned by China, by the Republic of China at this point in time. Tibet is against this, and that's where the ensuing conflict actually went on. And the bottom point there is that while this 3-point agreement was in place, the Chinese military was right across the Yangtze River, almost itching to actually go across and start the conflict. As peaceful as it was still some type of pressure to put on Tibet. Was just, hey, if you're not going to agree to our 3-point agreement, well, there's our military forces right across from Chamdo right there. Which then ensues now that the Tibetan government denies the 3-point agreement. That's where we have the Battle of Chamdo from 6 October to 24 October 1950. Basic numbers to put on the slide right there is the Tibetan military was only 8,500 troops strong in this area, and then the PLA at that point in time was 40,000 troops. Not only did they have a numerical advantage, they also had Soviet equipment. They were just coming from the Chinese Civil War, so they had very much battlefield experience, and then they were also overall well-trained as well. So this was a few days into the war, or already into the invasion. Of course, this was as the Chinese were trying to completely surround Chamdo. This is going to be a point that I'm going to bring up a little bit later in more depth. But as you can see, the Chinese forces on that right side of the slide is that they were completely surrounding Chamdo. They used the numerical advantage to completely surround all of the Tibetan troops to then have them surrender. So then the Chinese had zero resistance when they were actually going to go to the capital. So the tactics that we really saw here is 6 to 24 October. This was the bulk of the actual invasion, of the actual war. In terms of war, you wouldn't really consider that to be a very long time. So that's where we saw a large amount of speed by the Chinese PLA to then encircle, and then they also had the element of surprise. After the Tibetan military and government denied the 3-point agreement, the Tibetan military really didn't know when the Chinese were actually going to step across the Yangtze and invade. So that's where the surprise factor was in favor of the PLA. So then they were able to use encircling and their speed to actually put additional pressure and force the Tibetan military and government to accept the 3-point agreement. Unfortunately, though, as the Tibetan capital was encircled after the Battle of Chamdo, that was where the Tibetan government attempted to call out to the United States, to Britain, to the United Nations, surprisingly with the support of El Salvador, but all for naught. It was a little too late to actually start building those relationships to counter the Chinese aggression. And instead, there was a 17-point agreement at the end of the war. This was, again, purely based on force, although it was originally presented as, again, a more peaceful operation, even though there were Chinese forces basically forcing the Tibetan government to actually sign this document. So the first 3 points are very familiar. So the 3-point agreement was in there that China controls Tibet, to the Tibetan military was absorbed into the PLA, and then the China controls the foreign trade and relations. But I guess on the positive side, the power and position of the Dalai Lama were maintained, and then the Chinese forces in Tibet wouldn't disrupt Tibetan living to a point. There's a whole different discussion about what the Chinese forces did to Tibet, especially with Tibetan Revolution later on in 1959. But I'm not going to discuss that. This is more about what the actual tactics that China actually did. So additionally, to now say the situation for Taiwan. The image on the right is kind of where I want to start. These orange boxes are no entry zones announced by the Chinese military all around Taiwan. This is almost identical to encirclement. Around Taiwan, the Chinese are not immediately actually going into Taiwan, but they are acting all around it. This is almost identical to the same tactic that we saw around Chamdo, is that the Chinese military was around Chamdo, right across the Yangtze. In this situation, the Taiwan is just across the Taiwan Strait, and the Chinese military is not only on eastern China, but the People's Liberation Army Navy is also all around the Taiwanese island as well. So you can already see that it's very easy. I say that sparingly, but to already pre-position the Chinese forces around Taiwan to actually encircle it. The other thing that we also see is multiple times the Chinese government is trying to say that they want to incorporate Taiwan into the People's Republic of China using different propaganda. So in Tibet, it was a liberation. But the big question that stands is, if you look at the definition of liberation, you're liberating from some kind of strife, some kind of consternation. So what is that liberation from? And that's where that propaganda comes into play, is with the People's Republic of China trying to liberate or incorporate Taiwan. Are they being impressed by anybody? Those are the kinds of questions that immediately come up. But that's a tactic that we see that the Chinese are attempting to use consistently. But I know that the Taiwanese people themselves are not, the majority of them at least, are not up to being actually incorporated into the PRC. Like we saw against the Yangtze River with surprise, the United States, the coalition, the Japanese, everybody that is against the PRC actually invading Taiwan or trying to do any kind of deterrence, that's where the surprise is again in favor of the Chinese. We have no idea, the coalition has no idea when the actual invasion is going to happen. As you can see in the image, there are exercises going around the nation of Taiwan already. China has massive amounts of forces already on the East Coast doing different land exercises, marine exercises, naval exercises, air exercises all the time, which of course you can hear about in the news. And that's where is that surprise going to come from? Are one of those exercises actually going to turn into invasion? That's where the surprise is in favor of the Chinese. So that is a significant factor. Same thing with the force buildup. Because of all of these exercises, because of that surprise, we don't really know when or we can't identify what a force buildup would actually look like. And then a tactic that could be potential is a Taiwanese blockade. This kind of goes along with that encircling thing in Tibet. And so with the Taiwanese blockade, if it was successful, if the Chinese were actually able to surprise, maneuver, en masse around Taiwan, then a blockade could be a potential tactic that the United States would be worried about. That could be an aerial blockade, that could be a naval blockade, and if it's swift enough, a Taiwanese blockade could be detrimental to the overall response from the coalition. We wouldn't be able to fly in supplies. None of the actual shipping supplies could actually come into Taiwan because they'd have to face off against the PRC Navy. And then that blockade would have military and economic impacts, not only for Taiwan, but then also for Japan and for South Korea. Those countries are also very much trade partners with the Chinese, either export or import. So any kind of actual invasion would not only be economically impacting some of the coalition partners, but also with the military as well. as we could assume, any kind of invasion would come with not just an attack on Taiwan, but potentially on coalition partners in order to get that surprise factor. So basically the takeaways from this is I really want to strive that the Tibetan background, just the invasion, we're seeing the same potential tactics that can be brought up from the PRC, that when it was the ROC was very easily able to use surprise mass maneuver, and then also encirclement. We see those exact same tactics, one being effective throughout military history, and then two, very easy for the Chinese to actually do around Taiwan right now. Ways to get around that, though, these are the takeaways for the coalition at this point in time, is that picture right there is the Japan, US-Australian exercise over in the Pacific. More of these are necessary. Communications in denied environments are one of those things that is a very complicated military issue. And so communications between countries that don't speak the same language, that don't actually have the same tactics, techniques, training, expertise, actual technology is something that if the United States actually does more exercises with other foreign militaries, with the Australians, with New Zealand, all of those Indo-Pacific nations, I'm not going to say that it is a perfect solution, but it could be a more elegant and efficient use of military power if an invasion of Taiwan actually was to occur. And then the technology gap. This is one that was really identified by the Tibetan military. Truly did not actually have the technology to face off against the ROC. Not even talking about the numbers, just by pure technology. The ROC had so much more Soviet technology from the Civil War that they were coming from. It's not to the same degree now, but the technology gap is still significant. So the PRC right now, that basically all branches of the PLA have massive technology advancements over the last few decades in terms of Navy, in terms of aircraft, in terms of electronic warfare. The next peer is the United States, but then the United States is also then worrying about the other nations. So Australia, we're worrying about the Indian military, all of these southeastern peninsula militaries, South Korea, Japan. Some of them don't have the same level of technology as the PRC. So even though they might be able to provide numbers and actually balancing out that number game, the technology gap is also one of those most significant things that should be a takeaway for the coalition as well. So in summary, that was a real quick overview of how Tibet actually impacts how we can study today as well. I know that it was a land war versus a sea war, but the actual tactics and what we can take away from for today, it was surprisingly identical, to the point where I had to talk about it and present it to everybody. But I didn't want to take up a whole lot of time, and I didn't want to go crazy in depth. But if there are any questions or anything like that, I'm more than happy to take them into the comments or at the end. But thank you all for your time.
All right. Outstanding. Thank you so much, Brendan. A lot to think about from that. That analogy you gave about Beijing having surprise on its side when it does the exercises over and over again really makes me think about the Yom Kippur War in 1973, about the Egyptians continuously going up to the Suez Canal and the Israelis becoming complacent. So we definitely need to expand on that more in the future regarding the Pacific and the PLA. Awesome. Well, without further ado, Lieutenant Grant Willis, thank you all for coming, and appreciate you, Dr. Hall, for taking your time to come and talk to us today. There was a lot of insightful information. That was wonderful, and took a lot of notes, and I'm definitely going to be taking a look at that later on. And I'm going to share the screen with us right now so we can have that available. All right. Okay. So without further ado, let's get started on context, land-based air power's geostrategic influence in the Pacific. So basically what we talk about here is talk about a couple case studies throughout the Pacific War, and then a war crisis that happened after World War II, We want to bring up the Philippines in 1941 with the destruction of the Far East Air Force under MacArthur and General Brereton by the Japanese. It's almost considered the other Pearl Harbor for the Americans in the Pacific because it was so devastating. We want to talk about Force Z. So that's going to be your HMS Prince of Wales and Repulse, the Royal Navy battle group that got sent out to Singapore to go deal with the Japanese prior to the launch of World War II. And then we also want to talk about the 1958 Taiwan crisis that involved American Cold War policy against the Communist Chinese. So without further ado, let's start into the Department of Defense disclaimer. Views and opinions expressed or implied in CIPR are those of the authors and should not be considered the official sanction of the Department of Defense, Department of the Air Force, Air Education Training Command, Air University, or other agencies or departments of the government or their international equivalents. So just to make sure we got that out of the way. All right, so first off, we want to ask ourselves, what is the problem, right? We want to define the problem that we're facing before we come up with a solution. This one said that Einstein said, you know, give me an hour to save the world. I'm going to spend 55 minutes explaining what the problem is and understanding it, and then I'll spend 5 minutes solving the problem. So for us right now, what I wanted to give you visual of is the mighty American idea of power projection, right? The aircraft carrier, right? We just saw Top Gun come out. It's the symbol of America's reach globally. And to the left here, you've got the red square. You've got the DF-26 long-range land-based ballistic missile that's supposed to be a carrier killer. So right here, I want to ask a couple questions, right? How effective is our carrier force going to be in projecting that air power that we need in the Western Pacific forward to deter the Chinese from making a cross-channel attack against Taiwan, right? You know, you can make another Yom Kippur War analogy here where the Chinese are attempting to find out what America's strengths are and defeat those strengths through the few weaknesses that we do have with their weapon systems that they've developed over time based on the case studies that we're going to examine today. So a couple of questions we need to ask here, right? Is our carrier force going to be capable of achieving the decisive victory that we need to power project into the Pacific against the Chinese? And then also we need to ask, how does land-based air power protect the carrier force in the face of this kind of Chinese technology that they're developing, where we can actually be able to withstand attrition through dispersed land-based air power rather than relying on these national assets that are almost a national catastrophe if you lose one in combat, right? That's 5,000 Americans gone right there if you lose one in combat, and it amounts to an absolute catastrophe. So you have to be able to back up these different assets with varying assets that you can deploy downrange in a pre-positioned manner. So let's dive into the history behind this real quick. So another setup, we've got a map here. It shows the first and second island chain. Most of us are familiar with it. One thing I do want to ask, though, is what is the center of gravity in the Western Pacific from this map in everybody's opinion? You know, that's something that I'm going to answer for myself later. That's something that we can all answer ourselves. But to take into view that map and to understand the length, the amount of space that we're dealing with and the different islands that we're dealing with that can power project forward against the PRC. And I also wanted to give the folks watching a little bit of an idea of how big Taiwan is. That's a map of Florida right there. You've got Georgia. You can see Taiwan fits into Florida for the most part, right? But it's that's the relative size that we're dealing with. So you know, it gives you a good idea of the size differential between the massive mainland of China and the tiny island of Taiwan relatively, right? So to dive into the history part here, so the first case study we're going to use, 8 December 1941, with the destruction of the Far East Air Force under General MacArthur and General Brereton. This is the largest concentration of American air power outside the continental United States at the time. It's a very substantial force for the technology of the day, and how the doctrine developed for this technology was understood. You got P-40 fighter aircraft. You got B-17 bombers that are supposed to be the technological marvel as a result of the development of the United States Army Air Corps and the United States Army Air Force, right? These guys are supposed to be the high altitude precision bombing apparatus that's supposed to destroy the enemy's center of industrial gravity, and is the direct product of the Air Corps Tactical School's ideological development in the 1920s and 30s. It's the bomber mafia's dream. Well, these guys are stationed throughout the Philippines on the main island of Luzon, and the Japanese, before their supernova against the United States and the other allies, the Dutch, the British possessions, they realized the center of gravity of the Philippines is vital to their supply line security, moving from the Dutch East Indies through the main supply route back to Japan, right? So they have to secure that supply route, and air power can play a role in severing that supply route. Therefore, they have to attack the Philippines. They have to get rid of MacArthur's army there and subdue them. Now, the attack against Clark Field on 8 December was quite frankly just a lesson in the meaning of timing, right? The Americans had been alerted to the attack at Pearl Harbor. They had known that the potential for conflict with the Japanese was real, and they were on high alert. And they started to send their aircraft against any sort of marauding Japanese aircraft coming from Formosa, the main airbase island that the Japanese were going to project air power against the Philippine garrison. And the P-40s went up for a combat air patrol. They didn't see anything. They came down. And just like in 1967 Operation Focus with the Israeli Air Force against the Egyptians, just coming down to land and refuel, rearm, get ready for another sortie, the Japanese Zeros swarmed down and attack all of the active air bases, and they slaughter the Far East Air Force. They practically destroy it, render it combat ineffective. The B-17s had never been able to get off the ground and do any sort of daylight bombing mission over Formosa. Good luck with that. We all know how that turned out in Germany, right? But it just goes to show you that the idea of doctrinal development and understanding how these weapon systems are created before they're able to actually perform in combat, you just don't know how they're going to actually perform until you put them into the test of combat, right? So the B-17s, if they had been allowed to get off the ground and attack the Japanese air bases in return, could that have worked out really well? We just don't know, right? But we can speculate based off of the 8th Air Force experience over Germany in 42 and 1943. It wouldn't have been great. However, it would have been a lot better than sitting on the ground and getting caught on the ground, not able to participate in the contest at all, right? So what were the implications of losing this land-based air component so quickly and so early in this campaign? Well, MacArthur's Bataan garrison, the Luzon force that fell back to the Bataan garrison per the war plan, was left without any significant air cover. The Japanese had air superiority. There were a couple American fighters that were able to use, land-based dispersal areas in the Bataan Peninsula. But really, at that point, once the Air Force was destroyed, it didn't really, it wasn't able to provide that fire support necessary and air cover for the Bataan garrison, and eventually led to, despite heroic defense, the Bataan and Corregidor garrisons falling, right, in the fall of the Philippines. So that was definitely a key lesson in the importance of land-based air power for America, right? Now we're going to go into a couple days later, a very large lesson for the Royal Navy off the coast of Malaya and Singapore. So on 10 December 1941, a couple days after the disaster at Clark Field, HMS Repulse and HMS Prince of Wales, the pride of the British fleet, he had just gotten back from dealing with Bismarck. And he sets out with this force of 4 destroyer escorts to go and head off a Japanese amphibious assault force that's going to land on the Malayan Peninsula and threaten Singapore. So they're going to sail out there and try to intercept this amphib force. Well, the Japanese have something in store for them. A couple air bases outside Saigon, South Vietnam, twin-engine naval land-based bombers in the form of Betty and Nell aircraft are going to intercept this surface force, and they're going to destroy it utterly, right? This is the culmination of the battleship mafia versus the bomber mafia, where for the past 20, 30 years prior to this action, air commanders and naval commanders have been arguing about the implementation and the practicality of using air power against sea power, and what battleships were going to be able to survive against how many aircraft, and this caused a lot of inter-service rivalry. Well, despite having a wide array of organic air defense systems on the Strike Force and Force Z, the bombers were able to swarm this force and send it to the bottom in a single day. And really what we lacked was a coordinated air defense of this naval force and provide air cover from Singapore itself and Malaya. And it amounted to an absolute disaster for the Royal Navy. And Churchill was quoted as saying, this is one of the greatest naval disasters, the greatest naval disaster in Royal Naval history. So it just goes to show you the importance of utilizing the offensive capability of land-based air power rather than the defensive disaster that land-based air power can provide you if you get caught on the ground. And the third case study we want to go over here is the Taiwan crisis of 1958. Okay, so this is going to be a continuation of the Chinese Civil War. I know Brendan talked about how the Chinese Civil War ended, and it officially did, but the bastion of nationalist resolve in the island of Taiwan, otherwise known as Formosa, Chiang Kai-shek set himself up there with the remainder of the nationalist forces that he could get to that island. And constantly there were clashes between the communist Maoist regime on the mainland and Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists on Taiwan and the outlying islands that were off the coast, immediate coast of China, like Matsu and Quemoy. There were regular artillery clashes between the both sides, counter battery fire, there were air clashes. And in 1958, Mao took advantage of a international situation that he thought that the Americans were not going to be able to respond effectively to. The Americans were invading Lebanon at the time, with the Marines were hitting the beach in Operation Blue Bat. There was British, there were British involvements in Malaya at the time. The Chinese did not believe that the Americans would respond effectively to an attempt to seize one of the off-channel islands and a series of off-channel islands and eventually threaten Taiwan itself. So an amphibious assault was mounted against one of the offshore islands by the PLA. It failed. It was repulsed rather dramatically. And there were thousands and thousands of rounds of artillery pounding these offshore islands controlled by the nationalists. And the Americans responded pretty forcefully. They responded with a combination of Army, AAA, and SAM units immediately deployed to the American United States Taiwan Defense Command bases on Taiwan with Nike surface-to-air missiles. The composite air strike force concept was applied in the Western Pacific for the first time. In 1958, they had a concept of composite air strike forces where you took tactical air command and took a hodgepodge of tactical aircraft like F-101s, F-100s, B-57s, B-47s. You had B-66 aircraft, and you also had a mixture of ground attack aircraft like Marine Corps Air Group 11 with their Sky Rays and Sky Raiders. Put them all into a composite group and sent them off on ready alert to air bases in Taiwan itself. We used to have air bases on Taiwan through the United States Taiwan Defense Command. And we also had air bases on Okinawa, Japan. We had an air base on Guam. Anderson was loaded up. And these guys were all spread out, ready to provide an immediate reaction to any sort of contingency. And the plan, Op Plan 2558, under the Composite Air Strike Force, X-Ray Tango, was supposed to employ tactical nuclear weapons and atomic bombs against 62 mainland Chinese targets that involved mostly air bases. And you can see here, I've got various snippets of the top secret material that has now become unclassified. You've got the various bomb loads that are going to be allocated to the 3rd Air Division over in Anderson and Kadena. And also a snippet from that same document, I was able to identify that the Chinese were, by the Air Force Historical Division's assumption, was that the Chinese were trying to test American resolve here. And the Americans responded massively without really dipping into Strategic Air Command. Only 5 B-47 Stratojets, medium nuclear bombers, were readied at Anderson with nuclear bomb loads. That was the only SAC real participation, Strategic Air Command participation in this. This was a Tactical Air Command atomic deterrent mission, right? Here you also had the first clash between the MiG-17s and F-86 fighter jets with AIM-9 Sidewinders. It was the first implementation and victory and success for the AIM-9 Sidewinder air-to-air missile operated by the Republic of China Air Force. You also had several artillery clashes and attempted amphibious assault, like we talked about before. This was a military contest, but it was deterred. The Chinese communists were deterred because, one, they did not have atomic weapons to try and challenge the United States' atomic capability. They had to rely on the Russians to get them if they were going to be getting them. I doubt that the Russians would have actually gave them atomic weapons. They also lacked any sort of long-range artillery to prevent the United States Navy from sending its carrier strike force into the Taiwan area to provide more tactical air capability on top of the land-based air component that was spread throughout the Western Pacific, including Clark Air Base in the Philippines, right? Clark Air Base becomes very handy, not only in World War II, but in the 50s and also in Vietnam, as well as a stopping point on the way to Southeast Asia. So this crisis is very, it's not studied a lot. I think it needs to be studied more, especially from the air component aspect to it, and what the United States should take away, and as well as what we should understand what the PLA took away as far as lessons from this crisis. And the PLAAF, the People's Liberation Army Air Force, I don't know how they name their stuff, but it's ridiculous. But these guys only have had a primary combat experience as recent as 1958. It was the last time that the PLAF actually engaged in significant air-to-air combat. So and I say significant air-to-air combat, massive dogfights. So you gotta think about that aspect when you're thinking about the readiness and preparation of the Chinese Air Force and naval air component in relation to the West. So it's something to keep in mind, definitely something to think about later on. So with those case studies, I want to also mention the center of gravity, in my opinion, for the proper deterrence and defense of the Western Pacific for the Allies. That's the Philippines. The Philippines is a primary hub for land-based air power in the Western Pacific. There's a reason the Americans put the largest concentration of land-based air power outside the United States in the Philippines in the first place. Its power projection capability, its ability to hold massive amounts of air bases spread across multiple different islands, and its ability to respond immediately in the immediate combat area, that's Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea as well. Its proximity is key. And cultivating the relationship between Manila and Washington is going to be one of the greatest geopolitical challenges for diplomacy and military cooperation going forward to counter the communist Chinese and their aggression in the Western Pacific today. So the Philippine archipelago, I also wanted to add real quick before we move on, the amount of air bases and the amount of dispersal points and the amount of combat power you can pre-position and maintain readiness and capability there in the Philippines itself is going to be crucial, right? Time is everything. Speed is everything. Brendan talked about how the Chinese quickly enveloped their enemy, overwhelmed them with surprise, and cut them off. Speed in modern warfare is going to be vital. Understanding the data links, understanding how satellites get information back and forth, how weapon systems talk to each other, how autonomous systems can operate with manned capability. This is all going to be interconnected, and there is a clock that's going to be ticking when China does decide to make that move against Taiwan, whether that be through the use of force immediately, whether that means taking out American air bases that are concentrated throughout the Western Pacific that are already pre-targeted. We can't be naive and think that they're not. They're going to be key centers of gravity that we need to take hold of. In the Philippines, it's primarily, for me, my personal opinion, the number one priority for the alliance to cultivate and develop. And with that, some of the conclusions that I want to bring up here. So we kind of talk about lacking multiple air bases within immediate striking proximity of the Taiwan Strait is going to be crucial to developing that capability and expanding that capability to not lack those air bases and utilize the Philippines to do that. We want to also make sure our ground crews are prepared. Our base defense is going to be prepared, right? We were so used to this global war on terror and this coin doctrine of these maintenance crews and the base defense personnel operating under a non-high intensity environment. They're going to be eating cruise missiles. They're going to be under a constant fire if the Chinese are not lacking in that initiative, and they need to be prepared and trained for maximum readiness to turn aircraft and generate sorties in the face of immense pressure and immense stress they're not used to. And we need to be able to take a punch too, right? We need to be able to give the carriers time to inch forward into the second and first island chain as those missile defenses that the Chinese have set up become destroyed or degraded in any sort of way. And those land-based air components that are spread throughout the Western Pacific, including in the Philippines, will be key to taking that initial hit and giving it back. Also the last thing here, more air bases in the Aleutians in Australia need to be cultivated, need to be utilized. We need to be able to have multiple points of resupply, multiple points of refuel, multiple points of vector routes for our land-based air component in CONUS to get out to the Western Pacific and set up those stations. So lastly, with that, I want to conclude the Philippines, again, is the center of gravity for me in this discussion about land-based air power. And with that, here's my sources that I use primarily for this. And then if you have any questions, be happy to take that at the end. And I just want to end you with a quote here. A fighter jet is the deadliest weapon in existence in the sky, but on the ground, it is utterly defenseless. And that was stated by Israeli Air Force Commander Madi Had, the man in charge of executing Operation Focus in 1967. So with that, I'm going to leave it to Jose, and I will stop sharing the slides at this time.
Hello again. So thank you very much, Grant and Brendan, for those great papers, presentations. And now I'm going to figure out technology. Share screen. Where's my screen? There. Share. Okay, and then slideshow. There you go. There. Okay, so right now my presentation is going to be about building the Philippine Commonwealth Army. It's kind that's actually relevant in the sense that the keynote speaker mentioned about nation building, and even though the messy experience of the U.S. during the past several decades in nation building, but there was actually a time when nation building in the U.S. actually was successful in nation building, and that was its experience in the Philippines. There were many areas that the U.S. was successful in the sense that it wasn't just only we're talking here about the military, but also talking about other aspects in governance, health, and so on and so forth. So that's why when the Philippines got its independence in 1946, it was seen as a model country, and the United States was so. Actually, I think the Philippines might have been responsible for the succeeding decades of tragedy for the U.S. when it came to nation building, when it thought it could repeat its success in the Philippines in other areas, most significantly Vietnam. But anyway, that's another topic altogether. So now it's building the Philippine Commonwealth Army, or how the United States and the Philippines built an underrated military force that proved itself in battle. Okay, so we have here the pictures of the Philippine Commonwealth Army and people there. Now, prior to the Commonwealth, so if you're familiar with Philippine history, there was this period known as the American occupation, which is followed the Philippine-American War. Okay, the Filipino-American War, or we call it the Filipino-American War. American textbooks call it the insurrection. Now, in that period, the Americans, in order to impose colonial rule in the Philippines, they established several armed groups. Okay, and these were organizations. These were the Philippine Scouts, which evolved from various adult groups and supported the U.S. Army in operations against the Philippine Republican Army, which is basically the army that was fighting for independence from 1899 onwards. And then the other unit was the Philippine Constabulary, which was same as the Philippine Scouts, but more like a gendarmerie. And the Philippine Scouts and the Philippine Constabulary were U.S. led, more often than not, commanded by Americans, but the rank and file were Filipinos. The Philippine Constabulary, as it evolved, it became more and more Filipino staff. Now, sometime during the middle part of the American colonial rule in the Philippines, Japan began to be seen as an existential threat to the Philippines. We say that Japan was getting more and more aggressive. It was waging a series of wars against China. We are familiar with the 1937 Sino-Japanese War, but there were other military operations that were launched by Japan. But then, of course, was the buildup of the Imperial Japanese Navy, and because of that, the Philippine Scouts, which was an organization that had a primarily counterinsurgency orientation, but was strengthened to have a external role, also a capability, but not as spectacularly as others, But there were improvements that would try to strengthen it. But that wasn't the only thing that was a response. The only response that the American authorities in the Philippines had, together with their Philippine counterparts. In 1935, following negotiations and discussions with the American government, the United States and the Philippines agreed to the establishment of the Philippine Commonwealth. Finally, the United States, after its imperial war against the Philippines and its takeover, its colonial rule, it decided that, it agreed that the Philippines would be eventually granted independence. But in order to do that, there would be a 10-year preparatory period. So 1935 up to 1945, thereabouts. And again, because of the prevailing climate then, one of the first important, when the Commonwealth was eventually established in 1935, one of the first laws, or the first law that was passed was the so-called Commonwealth Act No. 1, or the National Defense Act. It is a law, the reason present tense is because it is still a law in the Philippines. It is a law aimed at establishing the capability of the Philippines to defend itself against internal and external aggression. Basically, it provides the ways and means to do so. The offshoot, the result of this was the Philippine Commonwealth Army, which was established in 1935 also. And Douglas MacArthur was brought in by Manuel Quezon, who was the president of the Philippine Commonwealth, to head a team of Americans, of which other distinguished or soon-to-be distinguished personalities would be Eisenhower, and to draft the Philippine Defense Plan. There was also another guy named Ord, another junior officer, or middle officer, looking at other countries, and they looked at other countries' experiences, Switzerland being one and others. The stated goal was to have 400,000 trained reservists after 10 years, established on December 21, 1935, with cadres and instructors coming from the Philippine Scouts and Philippine Constabulary. The core initially was the Philippine Constabulary, which was shifted towards the Philippine Commonwealth Army. The Philippine Constabulary would number in size to the total Philippine Constabulary would be somewhat similar to a European infantry brigade in size, the entire force itself. And when I'm talking about the large infantry brigades in Europe that operated that were around 5,000 thereabouts. So the PC was the initial core. A general headquarters and camps were built in 1936 or handed over by the United States. Then at most 40,000 men were called up on January 1937. The setup was that the Philippines would be divided into districts, around more than a dozen districts, approximately there. And then these military districts would produce from their area a division. And the division would not be, the division would basically be similar to, again, an infantry brigade in size for a European or Japanese army. It would be basically light divisions. So these were divisions that would look good in paper, but actually in reality, they were very light and lightly armed divisions. But for the Philippines, it was seen as good enough. By the night, because of two prevailing things. The resources and the way to train them. You could not come up with a mechanized army right away. Although there were experiments going along that line. By the end of 1939, there were 4,800 officers and 104,000 men in the reserves. So you could see here already there were problems happening. Almost 4 years later, they did not even reach. They reached only 1/4 of the 400,000 trained reservists. Okay, they hadn't even. There were problems in training because you couldn't expand it too much, too fast. There was still an emphasis on good training and quality training, but because of that, there would also be clashes with others who wanted more troops, more units to be trained. So again, you had the quantity over quality dispute or argument. So again, the United States Army units took charge of the training when it came to more complicated systems like heavy weapons and other types of large maneuver type training. It must be mentioned that the first combat mission of the Commonwealth Army was not against external forces, but against an internal rebellion that happened in the Philippines, in the southern part of the Philippines, namely the island of Mindanao, when Muslim rebels decided to stage an uprising. Now, problems. By 1938, how only 69,000 or barely 70,000 had been given intensive military training, in contrast to the projected 120,000 for a 3-year period at the rate of 40,000 a year. There were problems. One was, of course, financing. Number two also was Washington was still in dispute on what to do. It was difficult in getting support also from Washington. The U.S. was still very much in isolation mode and was slow in supporting defense measures, even in its other territories in the Pacific. It's another story altogether, but we have all of those defense treaties, those agreements, international agreements that curtailed improvement and development. Disagreements between Filipinos and MacArthur also as to the feasibility of the mobilization and procurement programs. MacArthur was the more aggressive, optimistic one. Filipino leadership, Quezon and officers of the Philippine Army, and some of them were West Point trained Filipino officers, tended to be more conservative in their assessment. So there were clashes about that. And there were attempts by Quezon to also control MacArthur's influence. And MacArthur, by the way, is the one and only Field Marshal of the Philippine Army. He was given that title, that rank by Quezon. So the Department of Defense was established in the Philippines to oversee the growth of the army, in a way to try to control or control MacArthur's very powerful influence in the growth of the Philippine Army itself. Over here, we have photographs of the Philippine Army. There. Then there were other services, quote unquote. You had the Philippine Army Air Corps established by law established by law also, in the same law, and the Offshore Patrol also established by law. The Army Air Corps and the Offshore Patrol were both would be what we would call the Air Force and the Navy. Okay, now standard equipment provided to the Philippine Army was primarily of First World War vintage, from Enfield rifles, 30 caliber machine guns, quick fire 18-pounder howitzers. Some French 75s were in service also. And there was also a single FT-17 tank. So as I said, there were experiments in trying to modernize the Philippine Army. Again, it must be noted that at that time, the IJA, or the Imperial Japanese Army, was also a First World War type equipped army. So it's not something to denigrate the Philippine Army about. So the Enfield rifle was still an effective rifle. So with the 30 caliber, the 18-pounders, and so on and so forth. The Japanese were also equipped with a motley array of World War I equipment, also, or improved varieties, improved standards of that. The Philippine Army Air Corps equipment consisted of cast-war, interwar combat and trainer aircraft, such as the P-26 Peashooter, of which a squadron was delivered, and the Boeing Stearmans. Okay, so the two major combat and training types of the Air Force, of the Philippine Army Air Corps, were Boeing products. There were other types, but mostly were inoperable by the outbreak of the war. That's your picture of a P-26. It still has the U.S. roundels, as you can see here, but it's already Philippine Army Air Corps pilots. That's turned over from direct from U.S. stocks in Clark. or Nicos or wherever. Okay. The offshore patrol was minuscule by any standards of the day and comprised only of 3 small torpedo boats as its main combat force bought from British yards, with the one constructed in the Philippines by the time war broke out. However, in comparison to the rest, the offshore patrol was the one which was equipped with the most modern assets of the Philippine Commonwealth arsenal at that time. And that's it, basically. So there were 3 of that. You see 2 torpedoes at the side, several other. Now, units of the Philippine Commonwealth Army, you could see here that there were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. There are 12 divisions, of which 10, sorry, I said 12 districts. There were 10 districts, and then there was the 2 regular divisions, the first and second, okay? The second was also a regular division, but it was primarily, it was said to be primarily composed of the Philippine Scouts, okay? Then you have the Philippine Army Air Corps, and of course, not there is the offshore patrol. Integration of the into USFA and war. By 1941, in principle, the Philippine Army had a strength approaching 100,000 in 12 light infantry divisions of 5K to 7K each. Okay. Disadvantage was it could not be concentrated but spread throughout the archipelago. However, majority were already concentrated in the zone to face the imminent Japanese threat. Oh, I meant 13 actually. Disadvantage, it could not be concentrated, but spread across the way. So you could see here the way it was spread. Some of the divisions were brought up towards Luzon. Some were left in the Mindanao and Visayas region, but the bulk was concentrated in Luzon. Now, combat record, it fought for 6 months in Bataan, performed way better, even for an army that started from scratch, okay? Even let's say if it had the Philippine Constabulary, but it started only in 1935, okay? Then it was still it was not even halfway through its objective by the half of the 10-year period. And it was forced into war with basically 100,000 men with various levels of training, equipped with cumbersome weapons, limited ammunition, but yet it fought for 6 months in Bataan. It actually carried out its duty, its mission to fight, and hold out. The only reason why Bataan fell is precisely because Washington wrote off the Philippines in favor of the Europe First policy. It performed way better than even older European armies like those of Yugoslavia and Italy. And we'll go into that if there are any Italians. It's a long story. Now was the core of the. It also was the core of the almost 1 million strong guerrilla resistance movement that played a crucial role in intelligence gathering and force multiplying for the Allied forces. So during the Japanese occupation, they conducted very valuable intelligence work. They were crucial in many of the later battles, like Leyte Gulf and so on and so forth, even the liberation campaigns of 1944 and 45. In fact, American forces were ready by the first quarter of 1945. American forces were depleted precisely because of the Battle of the Bulge. Okay, but in the Philippines, American combat divisions could continue because they were heavily reinforced by Filipino guerrilla units. So lessons learned basically. How did this army come up? Why was it successful? I would not see it as a failure, but why was it successful? Well, for example, yes, although there were disagreements, they all had a focused strategic vision. Both Filipinos and Americans knew that Japan was the enemy. Okay, there was no disagreement. Not like you hear right now when the Philippines, can't make up its mind if China's an opponent or not. Despite the fact that China's already seizing the entire EEZ of the Philippines in the western side. Now, commitment of those involved. Okay, there was commitment of those involved. Even though again there were financial limitations, but again the point was that even though there were disagreements, the Philippine and Americans tried to come up with a war-winning army, and they did. And of course, the motivation to fight. Okay, no matter how much there was no defeatism. Okay, now those 3, there may be more, but those 3 where I think the lessons that were learned and which now can, I think, be also be used to apply with the US as it engages other countries, especially including the Philippines up to now, when it comes to building capabilities and capacities for the Philippines. It's to look at those particular things. It's not in the matter of how many exercises you do, but what is the result of these things? Okay? Is our lessons really learned, or are and that basically is it. I am ending on time. Yes. Time 35.
Thank you very much, Jose. Thank you, Grant. Thank you, Brendan. If anybody has any questions, please put them in the chat. I may also, since it's a small enough group, you're welcome to unmute as well. But before we get to any of that, I am going to exercise chair and moderator's prerogative and ask the first questions. And I've got two, one for Brendan and one for jointly Grant and Jose. So we'll start with Brendan. And you advance the construct through looking at Tibet and relating it to Taiwan of a pattern of Chinese aggression, tactics of Chinese aggression. I'm curious how Hong Kong, particularly in the last few years, if not certainly since 1997, but definitely in the last few years, I'm wondering how that fits in to your to what you're arguing.
So I think the biggest difference is that Hong Kong and Taiwan is that Hong Kong is a part of China already. As much as the people of Hong Kong probably would want to say, that they're not, or that they want to secede, at least there's a document that says that they are, and that they still have some kind of autonomy. Taiwan is just not even a part of China at all, and that's where the invasion comes in. But there is a interesting point that I think that you're driving to, especially with Hong Kong, is there is a level of autonomy, kind of like that Tibet had, having their own legal system, having their own political system. That's basically what Hong Kong has right now. And kind of like how the ROC was attempting to do a peaceful liberation of Tibet, we have, and bear with me, the Law of People's Republic of China on Safeguarding National Security in the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. A very long-winded document that basically is I would also argue to be a kind of propaganda as well. The key points in that is safeguarding the national security of Hong Kong. That's what the PRC wants everybody to think, is they are safeguarding that national security, but they're safeguarding the national security against the pressure that the Chinese government is already putting on Hong Kong. So that is a similarity that I think definitely is there. And I think especially with Taiwan, we could see the same kind of thing happen, is kind of like how this document takes away Hong Kong, or the Hong Kongers' freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. We could see small pockets of communism trying to be placed in Taiwan from the PRC in a similar manner, trying to dismantle that democratic government in order to sway people's opinions. So then it becomes what actually would be a safeguarding of either national security for Hong Kong or for Taiwan. It actually is swaying people's opinions, which I would say is a tactic that is going to take a long time, but we have seen that the Chinese government is more than willing to play the long game, is to wait out basically other people, other political powers, other political leaders, in order to actually get to where they want to go at. I think with Hong Kong, we're not going to see an invasion, even though that a lot of the protests have turned out to be extremely violent. I think it will be a little bit more diplomatic at first, and then forceful afterwards, with like basically military police. I don't know. Does that sufficiently answer your question, Chris?
It does. It does. Actually, what made me think of it was when you had that line about the Chinese military sitting on the one side of the Yangtze waiting to go across, and seeing pictures. I think it was either 2019 during some of the protests, and you had the Chinese military sitting right at the border between the mainland and the Hong Kong special autonomous, I forget exactly what they call it. And that's what conjured it and made me made me wonder.
Well, I don't have to talk about encirclement because Hong Kong already is. So it's that's not something that has to be pre-positioned. And to add to that, not only were police able to encircle or just stand right outside of that area, but the I'll just call it the Hong Kong National Security Law, much shorter. Since that's already been blessed off by the PRC government, anything outside of Hong Kong, if there was a Hong Konger that was caught outside of Hong Kong, they are subject to that law at that point, and that's where we see all these protests. So in addition to what you said.
Okay. And this is for Grant and Jose. Most people, when they think of the Pacific, even from World War II, tend to think of it as primarily a naval theater. But we have talked a lot tonight about land power and land-based air power, which seems to suggest, and I'm asking a cosmic question and I expect cosmic answers from you guys, is this seems to suggest that there's a very important role in for land power and land-based power. And so I would like both of you to speak to that and kind of develop, see, I'm assuming you agree with me. If you don't, tell me, but if I'd like you to explore that a little bit further in terms of how land power and land-based power interacts with what's going on in the surrounding oceans.
Right. I definitely believe in that for sure. As an Air Force guy, Billy Mitchell, like I have a portrait of him in my bathroom, so I don't, but I wish I did. But land-based air power in the Pacific, really what you got me thinking about now is what is the purpose of it in relation to the Western Pacific, right? We saw examples of how it can hurt you or help you or deter aggression. But really, you have to look at now in the modern sense of what land-based air power is going to do to you for targeting, right? What is that going to give you in relation to the naval fight? Because if you're talking about whether or not land-based air power and naval power is better, which one is trumps the other one, it doesn't really. Oh, I just saw that. Yeah, okay. My girlfriend will definitely get me that for Christmas. The portrait of Billy Mitchell. I will definitely put that on there. She'll work on it. But yeah, you have to look at what's the purpose of land-based air power? What's it trying to project into? What's it trying to stop? It's naval power, right? And what's the major objective politically for the Chinese military if it's given the order to take Taiwan? Well, that's to land on the beach and inflict its will to obtain the political objective, right? So you have to intercede that. You have to find that. And using land-based air power throughout the Pacific and taking lesson from World War II, the American Air Force has a lot of experience. The Royal Australian Air Force has a lot of experience. The RAF, the Japanese have a lot of experience of using land-based air power to influence sea power, right? We saw it at Midway, failed miserably. We saw it at Guadalcanal kind of improve. We saw Bismarck Sea be devastating, right? George Kennedy, 5th Air Force taking off out of New Guinea and Australia to hit the Japanese relief convoy that was headed for the north coast of New Guinea and completely destroying the convoy outright using land-based air power. It was a pivotal moment. So it displayed to not only MacArthur, but also to the Japanese that you can island hop and use these land-based bombers and these attack aircraft to influence the outcome at sea and help cut Japan off. That's what became so important about the Philippines partially. Not only was it to liberate the Philippines from years of brutal occupation and obtain an American promise to return and restore the Philippines to freedom, but it was to cut off the Japanese main supply route of raw material coming from the Indies that were formerly Dutch controlled, coming up through to Japan, right? And today, using land-based air power to mainly target centers of military gravity is going to be really important, right? So targeting amphibious assault forces is going to be a key objective for the United States Air Force. At least it should be, in my personal opinion, right? It should be a key objective for naval air power, for land-based air power, Marine Corps land-based cruise missiles and naval strike weapons. It should be the primary gravity to destroy the amphibious assault ships and amphibious brigades that are specially trained to do the beach assault that's required to open the door D-Day style to try and take Taiwan itself. So if you can destroy those ships and destroy and degrade significantly the supply lines through the use of effective long-range and short-range air power and disperse it properly and make it survivable and attritable, but also effective in the opening blows of an invasion, that's going to be key, right? One of the main things I like to think about is, you know, what does Hermann Göring wish he had on June 6, 1944? What does everybody wish they had? They wish they had, on the German side, air power. They wish they could have done more to dent that massive amphibious convoy coming across the channel to land those divisions on the beach, right? And that concert, if you have that concert in the air with the ground element defending the beachhead and defending at the water's edge with armor, you've got a very, very, very difficult task as the beach landing individual, right? You've got a very, very, very
almost worked in Salerno. If you actually look at the Salerno invasion and the air attacks in the bay there, because it was a very confined space with the Luftwaffe, and then of course the German armor nearly driving Fifth Army into the ocean. You know, that makes an interesting case. Jose, how about you?
Well, for me, basically, air power, land-based air power fulfills in today's situation. It fulfills two functions. Of course, Grant already talked about the military capabilities of it, which I will not anymore go into. But the other one also is should I term it a soft power, wherein you need land bases in the Philippines in order to project air power to assist in, as you would call it, humanitarian assistance and disaster response. Okay, sometimes that's the vehicle for getting to the good graces of many governments in that area. So an increase in the Philippines' receptiveness to allow America to utilize Philippine territory, because that's basically what the Philippines is. It's a big real estate for the U.S. Military. Because the Philippine military itself is still, it's not in a position to undertake many roles in external defense. So up to the foreseeable future, it would still be the United States military. And basically, the air bases that the Philippines provide under EDCA, the Visiting Forces Agreement, the Mutual Defense Treaty, this provide them a U.S. with much greater flexibility, also redundancy, because I think that's the root now. It's redundancy of bases because of the fact that with the Chinese building up their capabilities in the South China Sea, in their artificial islands, they're improving every now and then. It makes already identified Philippine facilities vulnerable to Chinese attack. So there's, I think, a shift towards identifying at the very least five more areas for development. Okay, so that if one is taken out, there will still be others. Okay, that's in a conflict. Or if, let's say, there's an HADR situation in the region, then these places could be used as projection. Something like that, just to add to what Grant is saying. So yeah, it fulfills a very crucial function also.
I know in discussions we've had offline, we've talked about how the Pacific, unlike most other parts of the world, you need air, sea, and land all working together, or you're not going to get done what you need to get done. And it sounds like what was true certainly in the Pacific War 80 years ago remains true today when we look at potential conflict areas.
But one thing I'd like to add is that, well, the Philippines is also your cork. It's a cork. If it goes, China's just going to burst all the way to the Central Pacific. And, the Chinese have a way of, uncorking the Philippines. Money.
What is it they called the Manila for a long time? The crossroads of Asia?
Yeah. Yep.
And it still is. Actually, to what the keynote speech was, where you stand depends on where you sit, and the view from Manila has always been a crossroads. You're right. I'm going to open it to other questions. If anybody in the audience has any questions, feel free to either put it in the chat or unmute. For any of the panelists, all the panelists, feel free to, I'll give a chance if people want to ask some questions.
My question, I have the observation for, like, it's not like a question, but what Brandon showed us about the Tibet and the Taiwan's analogy, I guess it doesn't fit in the scenario, in today's scenario, but at least we can talk about Tibet. But when we talk about the Taiwan, invasion of Taiwan, China already said that Taiwan is a province of China. It already is repeatedly saying, until and unless I see that if like the incidents like the Speaker Pelosi's visit, or like the third year term of Xi Jinping, any provocative action is done by the both sides. And what the threat is there, where I see that it's in the Eastern Himalayas. I have been saying this since last 2 years when there was a Galwan face-off in 2020, and the border disputes in a border clash in India and China, where you guys are talking about the invasion of Taiwan. And in the last 3 panels, like the people who are from National Defense University from Taiwan, the speaker and the even speaker from Australia. So yes, there's a threat. Like we are just taking it's a threat. Like China is invasion of Taiwan, but I'm not sure. Like, is China going to invade Taiwan unless there is not any provocation? You just want to get your marks. And if China does it, so what's the West going to do? What's the United States strategy there? Like just supplying the arms, like in the Ukraine war, like they are doing, and then war will go like 7 months, 8 months, maybe the 2 years, maybe the 3 years. So how did you see? I'm not asking to give the answer like any official position, just journal. I have the journal. What your take on this?
Well, I will jump in real quick. Having written recently on the China in World War II, in many ways, the People's Republic confronts the same issues that Chiang Kai-shek's China faced geostrategically in the late 1930s. They've got hostiles, or not hostiles, but they've got adversaries to the east that limits their access to the Pacific and beyond. In that case, it was the Japanese basically conquering the east coast of China. So then how does China get out? And they look west, they look southwest, and that puts you at Burma, Myanmar today. And to me, it's no coincidence that China has recently built an expressway and is building a second parallel expressway on the old Burma that roughly parallels the old Burma road corridor, and it runs all the way to the border. And then you get to the Himalayas, as you pointed out. And then the other option, which was because Russia was neutral in the war, was closed off, but is not to the PRC, but it was closed off during World War II. Is Russia. And so it's kind of, when you look at the geographic factors, what applied in the 1930s and 40s in some ways still applies today. So you're right, the Eastern Himalayas to me is underappreciated. You see it with what China's trying to do with Belt and Road, trying to get around and get through, just like they were trying to back, and that's probably a whole presentation for a whole other time. But I did want to mention that. I think you're right to point that out. It's not just looking eastward. They're looking elsewhere.
I don't think I can sufficiently answer the question because I'm not going to say definitively, yes, China is going to invade unprovoked, or no, that they are not. I think there are some schools of thought to both sides of the discussion. Personal opinion, I think it comes down to, does China want to look like the quote unquote bad guy or good guy? Something that I've been talking about this entire time is that every single time, well, not in absolutes, the two times that I've presented so far in Hong Kong and in Tibet, China has been trying to look like the good guy. It is national security. We are liberating a country. I don't think that China is at that point where they have the global opinion or even the Taiwanese opinion that if they were to liberate, and I use that in big quotes, liberate or actually invade Taiwan, I don't think that they're at that point where everybody agrees. So then their actual violent action wouldn't seem as violent. Now then the question is, if there were additional visits, kind of like Speaker Pelosi, or if there was any kind of provocation by any coalition ally or Taiwan itself, would China actually invade? I think if China was provoked, yes. I think I'm more leaning towards that side than no. But what would actually provoke China to do that, I don't know. That would be that's where I think the lines get really, really fuzzy, depending on what is actually an act of war versus what isn't an act of war. So I know that doesn't sufficiently answer that question, but that's at least where my mind is at.
Thank you.
And I saw a message that to Brendan's point, the U.S. national security strategy reaffirms one China. And to your point, that seems to, particularly Speaker Pelosi's trip, is a major pressure point, if you will, particularly for the People's Republic, is any potential threat to the one China or any perceived threat to the one China policy. That's something I just wanted to bring that forward. Other questions, comments, snide remarks? I'm glad somebody laughed at that. Well, seeing none, I want to thank all of you for your presentations and the questions and the discussion. We get the last word at this conference, and I hope it's been a good, strong one, and gives people some things to think about. Again, we're using the past, we're studying the past. You know, this is a region that has a long memory, and in many ways, understanding the past informs the present, but also will influence the future. And that's you'll be seeing a lot more great content from us, including some podcasting here in the not too distant future from us. So thank you for putting this together, Indu. It's been a great last few days, and I will throw it back to you to wrap us up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. And I
think you accidentally muted yourself.
I'm sorry. And Jessica and Manasa are here. They are in our organizing committee. So I would like to have the words concluding what their experience about the conference, or they want to say something. And I invited the other people of the organizing, but I know they are at the job at the time. They are doing some part-time job. So it's okay. Jessica, go ahead, please. And
Sure. Thank you so much, Indu. It was such a wonderful opportunity to be able to present and to get such wonderful insight from the panelists. I'm actually reaching out to one now to connect because I had the opportunity to read some of his work, but just really great insight. I was just really surprised by even the range of backgrounds. And so it was just truly a wonderful experience, really well done. The moderators did a great job in facilitating dialogue and questions. So I'm definitely thoroughly impressed, and congratulations to you and Chris for putting together a great conference.
Thank you, Jessica. Manasa, please introduce yourself a bit, whatever you're doing. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Indu. Thanks, Jess. I'm a PhD candidate at the Division of Global Affairs, and I work on non-traditional security threats, such as climate change. I was on the panel, I was moderating the panel on the US-ASEAN relationship in the Indo-Pacific region. And like today's panel, there was a lot of discussion on China and Chinese interests in the region, which was very interesting to hear. And the chair himself was a former ambassador from the region. So I think he facilitated a very well-balanced discussion, which was very insightful and really helped me get some new perspective on my own research, as well as did today's panel. So thank you so much, everyone. It was really great. As a young scholar just starting out, I think this has been a wonderful experience. So thank you.
I'm very glad to hear that.
Thank you, Manasa. So let's wrap up our conference here with our keynote guest speaker, Dr. Hall. Thank you so much, chair, speakers, moderators, participants, and all who supported this event, this conference directly and indirectly. We had 35 speakers from Australia, Taiwan, Japan, and Korea, and South Asian, India, Pakistan, and itself from the United States, and from the Glasgow University in the UK. So that was a very wonderful. I have received the messages and emails of these wonderful discussions, panels, and hope we'll keep doing this in the next year, hoping to do it in person, and many more collaborations in the coming year. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Indu. Thank you, Chris.